So Bruce mentioned this Chasm thing yesterday, and as soon as he started talking about it, I was like, oh man, I got to rewrite my entire talk. But thankfully he got a few things wrong, and but I really appreciate what Bruce said. And so actually, this in many ways this is going to be kind of talking about some of the same things from a very different angle. As some of you may not know because I actually have a PC up there, sorry. But I am getting a Mac within a month or so. I'm going back. I used a Mac before some of you were born. In fact, most of the people at RubyCon, before some of them were born, certainly. If I'm evidently about 4 years older than the average attendee, 4 times older than the average attendee at RubyCon, according to what Bruce said. But I grew up, as far as my software career goes, pretty early on. I stumbled upon this funny little thing called Smalltalk. So something that Bruce talked about. Obviously, you can tell that Bruce didn't grow up in that same culture because he spelled Smalltalk with a capital T. And everybody in here who's used Smalltalk knows Smalltalk spelled with a small t, and that's okay, Bruce. Everybody makes that mistake. Who doesn't use Smalltalk? But anyway, I know there's a few other Smalltalkers in the room. Yeah, and now if you spell Smalltalk with a capital T, people think you've actually used it. So, a small t, sorry. So anyway, so there's a couple Smalltalk guys in here. But one of the things I wanted to talk about is this whole idea of does Ruby have a chasm to cross? Because with a lot of young folks in here, I remember when I was like you guys, I was in my early 20s, starting to go to these conferences, and every once in a while I go to these object-oriented conferences, and they bring up somebody like Larry Constantine, and like, what are they bringing this old guy up here for? And Larry, I mean, he can't even spell Smalltalk. He has a capital T in there. But I would wonder, like, what is he actually going to add? And somebody pointed out, they always bring the graybeards in here because these guys have been talking at these conferences for a while and they don't know what else to do. And so now I am one. And but one thing I actually learned from when I listened to guys like Larry Constantine, and guys who, if you don't know who Larry Constantine was, he was famous back when the Beatles were, which is Paul McCartney's first band. Which, if you don't know who Paul McCartney is, just forget it. Anyway, but he was one of the guys who were big on structured software development, structured design, structured programming, which was the big thing before object-oriented stuff was. And then people stopped doing object-oriented stuff and dropped the oriented because they weren't. So, you mentioned C++ the other day. C++, by the way, is object-tolerant. It's not object-oriented, right? So anyway, but I want to talk about learning from history because actually I went through all the stuff. I shouldn't say all the stuff. A lot of the stuff that's happening right now with Ruby, I went through in the Smalltalk community, and I can look back now as a historian, having actually lived through the history of it, and I think I gleaned some wisdom from that, and I'm also learning a lot from what's different, and I want to just kind of give a perspective, what's similar, what's different, what can we learn from, and so we're gonna talk about that a little bit today. As you can see, by the way, Austin up here, one of the contestants, he's my proxy because I don't code that much anymore. Now, I coded for like 12 years in Smalltalk, so all the things you guys are talking about, I understand. But as far as like writing a Rails application or 10 or 20 a couple nights a week, I don't do that much. Right? I've done enough Ruby programming to be dangerous. I'm not sure if I'm any more dangerous than Bruce is or not. Maybe Bruce and I can have a Ruby shootout and just see. I don't know. What do you think, Bruce? Who knows? All right. Anyway, so what am I actually talking about up here? Basically, I'm talking about what is this concept of the chasm that Bruce mentioned yesterday, and talk about why Smalltalk didn't make it over the chasm. And then say, okay, well, that was then, this is now. There's some similarities, maybe, but there's some differences, maybe. Let's talk about that a little bit, and therefore, is it even relevant for Ruby? And if it is real and relevant, what might we do about it? How can the Ruby community cross it, unlike the Smalltalk community, which didn't? So I'm going to give you the quick theory of crossing the chasm. Technology Adoption Theory 101. This technology adoption theory, by the way, was developed in like the 50s, like 1957 specifically, and they were studying like different technology adopted by like cattle farmers, right? So it's obviously very relevant to programming languages. But the basic idea here was that there's this bell-shaped curve about how technology gets introduced. Bruce alluded to this earlier. And these numbers, these percentages are, very scientific, of course. They studied cattle farmers in 1957. But the idea is that, there's a handful of people, 2.5% or so, that are the innovators. They'll try anything. They just like it. They'll, do stuff like Jay does. I mean, it's, hey, wouldn't it be cool to, start programming my phone? Sure. Some people just aren't that interested in it, but some people are. And these are techies, they'll do that. And, all they have to do is, install Linux on it and whatever. And other people are like, Linux, what's that? Right? The innovators, they'll just try anything they hear about. They'll install Ruby on Stop OS. I mean, they're crazy. Then there's the visionaries or the early adopters. This is Bruce, you got your early adopters and your early majority mixed up. But the early adopters, these are the visionaries. These are the guys who take what those innovators did and say, hey, I've got an idea of actually using this for something besides playing at night when I'm not watching TV, right? And these are the guys who take that and say, I want to exploit this technology in some way, exploit it in a positive way, hopefully, and get ahead and be ahead of the rest of the market, and based on that strategic advantage, I'm going to accomplish something. So the guys are not quite the innovative. They won't try everything, but they'll try some things if they really think it's going to get them ahead. And then there's the early majority. These are the guys where the pragmatists start coming in. These are the guys like, okay, let's see. Bruce alluded to this is the kind of way a pragmatist looks at it. How much does it cost me to do in Java? How much does it cost me to do in Ruby? If you can give me hard numbers, I can run a spreadsheet. I'll do it. Now, you can't really give them hard numbers, but if you give them something that's close to hard, they might do it. But these are the guys who are like, if you can prove to me that it's going to work, my risk of not doing it is way higher than my risk of doing it. I'll do it. All right? And their idea of risk might be different than your idea of risk, especially if you're an innovator, because your idea of risk isn't, there's no risk. I'm just trying something out at night, right? Or whatever, on weekends. This is when the early majority gets in. The guys say, look, I got to do this eventually. I might as well do it now. The late majority is the guys who say, okay, I knew I'd have to do this eventually. I guess I'll do it now. Right? That's the real difference. And actually, we were just talking about this a little while ago with technology. These guys actually save money on the technology. They get it when it's cheap. Right? These guys buy the CD players 2 or 3 years after they came down. These guys bought their CD players the first year. These guys bought it when it was $1,000. Right? These guys bought it when it was like free with the iPhone or something. I don't know. I guess you wouldn't get a CD player with an iPhone. That's too ancient. Never mind. They wouldn't buy an iPhone. Anyway, and then there's the late market. These are the guys who will never do it unless they're absolutely forced to, and by then it might be too late. We don't really care about them. This Crossing the Chasm book, if you haven't seen it, it's still available. I got this one pretty cheap through Amazon, but and you get them. I didn't get it. I got it somewhere else. Get it cheap. There's a lot of them out there, but it's a marketing book, and they basically say, you know what? We don't market to these people. The only effect these people really have on the market is they're skeptical, so they keep these guys from buying. Because they'll never buy, and they're going to tell these guys they'll never buy. These guys don't listen to those guys. Right? So that's a whole other story. We're not going to get into marketing. But anyway, so Crossing the Chasm, that's the book that came out in 1991. It was a pretty hot topic. In fact, most of the people in the Smalltalk community were reading this thing, figuring how are we going to cross the chasm. They didn't even know what a chasm was, but somebody read it and decided we better pay attention to this thing because small talk's growing. We better figure out what's going on. So a whole lot of folks in the small talk industry were reading this book at the time when it came out the first time. And it's based on this diffusion of innovations theory from Everett Rogers, which was based on the technology adoption life cycle. And basically, he asserts that there's this chasm between the early adopters of a product, the technology enthusiasts, the innovators, visionaries, and the early majority. And he kind of explains the difference in their expectations and how you might go about crossing this. And this is really only applicable for disruptive or discontinuous innovations. It's not applicable for, I'm going to release, 1.2 of something I'm already using. Right? That's just kind of a whole different world. But for discontinuous innovation. So anyway, here's the summary of it. I mean, if you don't want to read the book, just read this slide. The idea is that visionaries, these guys in the early adopters, will take an 80% solution and make it work. Right? These are the guys who will take adhesion, 0.80 or 0.7, whatever it is right now, right? They'll take that and they'll actually start trying to build something with it. Because they're like, okay, yeah, it doesn't answer all the questions, but we can fix that, and as soon as we fix it, we're ahead of the game. Right? These guys say, yeah, when you got it installed 5 places and it's 1.0 or maybe 2.0, then I'll use it. I want it to be working all the way. I can't deal with this 80% solution thing. I need a 100% solution. And the 100% solution can be a combination of product and services. It doesn't really matter. The price is, in many ways, the price is not really the issue, unless the compelling reason to buy it is the price. Right? But they've got to have a 100% solution. Most of the stuff that's talked about here, the early majority is just like would be, if the early majority was at this conference, they would just be shaking their heads at you guys. Right? They would just be like, yeah, right. I'm going to do games with that stuff. Right. I'm going to really put my call center on this thing. Yeah, right. That's no way. Right? Which kind of should give you a feel for where Ruby is, but we're going to talk about that in a minute. All right. So that's all I'm going to talk about in detail about crossing the chasm. Now let me give you a little bit about small talk history, and hopefully as I talk about it, it'll become a little bit more relevant. How many people in here have programmed in small talk before? Okay. So we had about maybe 10%, something like that. How many programmed in small talk for more than 3 months? Okay, now we're down to less than 5%. Okay. And the ones, I know there's a few of you here who've lived through some of this history with me. Please don't correct me. This is my version of the history of small talk.
Not in your presence.
Not in my presence. Yeah, tell me about it afterwards. No, but I mean, actually, the point is that I want to get through it quickly for a reason. So if we spend a whole lot of time talking about whether I would write on every detail or not, it's going to distract us from the rest of the talk. But small talk was basically inspired by Alan Kay's Dynabook vision. He wrote a paper in 1972 calling it basically a personal computer for children of all ages. And his basic idea was that we should get this technology and put it in the hands of everybody, including children who can explore their ideas. And I mean, this is radical stuff. I mean, think of 1972. If anybody had access to a computer, they were accessing it by bringing a stack of cards to some place and hoping it ran overnight. Right? This is a pretty radical idea. You got to think about just how far visionary this is. We look at some of Alan Kay's concepts, and we laugh at some of them, saying how short-sighted they were, but not most of them. Actually, he's still got a vision out there. He's still pushing it, actually. But a couple of things he says about this handheld Dynabook that basically was kind of a shared mainframe versus a shared mainframe, but basically all the power of what you would have on a mainframe, having this at your fingertips. Imagine that. That user interface would have to become a learning environment. Think about that. User interface would have to be a learning environment. How many people think Windows is a learning environment?
Depends what you want to learn.
Depends what you don't learn. Okay. Yeah, to a certain extent, it is. I mean, you click enough buttons, you see stuff happen, right? But it's not something that you don't say, oh boy, if I just get in front of my computer, right? Just by exploring this stuff, I'm going to be learning. You just don't think that way. But we kind of locked into here's the way you do GUIs now, and oh well. But this is a quote from a paper he wrote in the history about the history of Smalltalk. It says, "The needs for large scope reduction in complexity and end user literacy would require that data and control structures be done away with in favor of a more biological scheme of protected universal cells interacting only through messages that could mimic any desired behavior, also known as objects." Right? At least his vision of what objects were supposed to be about. And that was basically, he's saying, look, if we're going to try to get this stuff that's in a mainframe, the power of a mainframe down into the hand, it's like there's way too complicated. I mean, stuff we're using mainframes for now, you have to be an assembly programmer to do stuff. We can't give them assembly language. We got to give the kids. I mean, you're not going to be messing with registers and binary math and stuff. We need to be able to let them try stuff out and have, hey, if I tell this thing to do this, what happens? And that was his vision. So back in the 70s, if you've never been to, actually, I was blessed in the 80s to actually go to Xerox PARC. Xerox PARC is Palo Alto Research Center. It was a place where, when Xerox was making all that money from the Xerox machines way back when, they used to take all that money and they would take it in a dump truck and they just dump it at Xerox PARC. And these guys would do all kinds of amazing stuff. In fact, it was really amazing in the 80s when I visited the place. Somewhere along they were showing me something. I said, wow, that's really neat. Can I get a printout of that? If I can take it back with me? And there's a printer. I think there's a printer around here somewhere. I'm like, you have these incredible machines in front of you. You don't have a printer? Well, we don't use paper. Everything's on a network, and we have TCP/IP, and we have what? Yeah, well, internet, Ethernet. Huh? Right? I mean, they literally, and the only people who had to think this, the only people who had a paperless office was Xerox. Which is why this never came out of Xerox. Right? Or Xerox never exploited this thing. They couldn't figure out, how do we take this people who make money by copying papers into the paperless office world? That's kind of radical. So that's a whole other story. Why I didn't take it. But anyway, so Smalltalk history unfolds. 1981, a Byte magazine article comes out. Actually, the whole Byte magazine was pretty much dedicated to it. And the idea of Smalltalk leaving the ivory tower generates a lot of discussion. In fact, you talk to anybody in the 80s who read that article, whether or not they ever did Smalltalk. As soon as you talk about, I do Smalltalk. You do Smalltalk? Man, I read that article in the Byte magazine in 1981, and I was really inspired by it, but I never thought anything was going to come out of it. You're actually doing it? What a weird thing. 1983, the Smalltalk 80 books come out. Basically, after they released Smalltalk 80 and Xerox decided not to do much with it, they decided, well, let's write about it at least. And they wrote these books. And actually, by 1983, you can also get an implementation available for a license fee, unless you happen to be one of the few ones who got it earlier, before the 80s, which we'll talk about in just a second. There happened to be a bunch of demos done to various people. Xerox was an investor in a little company called Apple. Steve Jobs came in and saw some of the things that were happening at Xerox PARC and said, I've got this project called the Lisa Project, which I've been trying to figure out what to go with it. I get this concept, but this stuff's pretty amazing. And anyway, since Xerox wasn't doing anything with it, and some people at Xerox PARC were kind of frustrated they weren't, they went to work for Steve. Some of them did. And the Lisa was released in 1983 and the Macintosh in 1984. And that was truly inspired by a trip to Xerox and Smalltalk. So while that's happening, while Steve's out there selling Macintoshes, Smalltalk's getting commercialized. At first, no one noticed. Apple, on the Macintosh, you could actually get for $50, you could license a copy of Smalltalk. I'm not sure how many people bought it, but not many. They didn't know what a Macintosh was, so certainly buying Smalltalk was even weird. Xerox had some pretty amazing workstations, which if you happen to be at Xerox, you could see them. They never really released them. I guess they had a large contract with the CIA, which no one really knows the details of. But they developed a lot of really interesting workstations back then. They were pretty powerful that ran Smalltalk. If you bought any of those machines, you'd have Smalltalk on it. And Tektronix released a 4400 series of workstations that came with Smalltalk installed. That's about it. And then Xerox, people at Park who were left at Park decided, let's run with this thing, and they spun off a company called Park Place Systems. And their philosophy was back to the Dynabook. I mean, they really believed in this whole model of this personal computer thing. They all, I guess having lived with Alan Kay for several years, you couldn't help eat, drink, and breathe the stuff. And that was kind of the philosophy of the company. So, if we're going to build this thing and it's going to be so good, people are going to come. And just to give you a feel for what that mentality meant, this is the same time Sun workstations were coming out. A company called Sun that nobody really heard about, right, before that. But they were starting to get hot right around the same time Park Place came. And Sun was looking for a windowing system and a powerful development environment, and they approached Park Place and said, hey, tell you what, we'll give you $50 per seat if we just install it everywhere, and it'll be our operating system, our Windows system, everything. Like $50 a seat, no way. We don't care that it's installed. We're going to sell it for $2,500. Everybody's going to buy it anyway, right? Once they realize how great it is. Anyway, so that's what they decided. And post history to that. So instead of installing Smalltalk 80 on that, they looked for some other Windows system. They hired a guy called Gosling, who put this thing called News on it, and ended up working there a little later. I don't know. Anybody heard of Gosling? Gosling guy. What did he do?
Auer, right?
Oak, Java, right? That guy. See, so they were their own demise right there. But anyway, they were pretty expensive stuff. There was some people saying, we can't make that expensive. We got to make it accessible to the masses. Kind of their idea of open source, right? Back then. I mean, again, this is not to knock these people. They didn't know any better, right? So there was a small company called Soft Smarts that said, let's put this on a PC. They sold it for less than $1,000 until they got into some really hairy licensing issues with Park Place, and they decided to fold because they couldn't make it. In the meantime, a little company called Digitalk came out with their version of Smalltalk, and the first version of it was called Methods. Methods was $69 list price, and Methods was a character-based version of Smalltalk. $69. If you read that Byte article, you might cough it up. And a lot of people did. Because no one was going to pay $2,500 or $5,000 for something that ran on a workstation, which they couldn't get their manager to buy a workstation anyway. So they bought this Methods, and then a little while later than that, they came up with this thing called Smalltalk V, which is not the same as Smalltalk 80. They didn't license anything. They basically went to all the stuff that was in the public domain and figured it out themselves. And they started pricing it less than $100. No runtime licenses. They sold a bunch of them. Now, of course, they had to sell a bunch of them to compete with selling one of them at $2,500 or more, but they did. And all of a sudden, people started doing stuff with Smalltalk. So just to give you an idea of what Smalltalk 80 looked like back then, this was what the official Smalltalk 80 looked like. A little browser, Windows, all this kind of stuff. Doesn't look kind of ho-hum now. Back then, it was radical. I mean, you show somebody a demo of this, and they just couldn't believe it. Think about, again, most of the people who are still just getting over using a terminal to type in things rather than cards, right? Methods looks like this. Character-based Windows, kind of really clever. But these are, all these, this is character-based, right? So this corner, that's an ASCII character, right? And they made all that stuff work. And then Smalltalk V came out. This is great. They were in color. Look at that great use of color. Right, different colored windows, and the Macintosh. This is what it looked like when I used it way back when. Very, very great user interface. And when you look at that now, it's not very inspiring now, right? But back then, there it was. So that's what we were dealing with as GUIs back then, right? So these are the GUIs of the late '80s. And what happened with GUIs of the late '80s? The early adopters of Windows-based systems in the late '80s, they were Macintosh people, right? Hobbyists, people said, this is kind of cool. I'll buy one of these. It's a couple $1,000. Hopefully my wife won't get too mad, or my spouse, whatever. So they buy these. And all of a sudden, people in the visual businesses got into this, right? They could see it right away, Hey, I can do all this artwork and graphics and stuff. So, and they still, Apple still kind of owns that market. And they owned it then, and unfortunately, they didn't really cross the chasm for other people at that time, but they grabbed that market, right? Workstations were, the engineering companies were getting this idea of having these workstations, not working with mainframes anymore. So they were coming out, and they almost all had some kind of Windows-based system on them. And but really, both of these folks ignored mainstream businesses. IBM had a monopoly on existing running business systems, right? Anybody who's using a computer to run their business was on an IBM world. And these guys were just thinking, these engineering folks, these real bright guys, these innovators, were all thinking, this stuff is so much better. We'll just replace IBM. Who cares? Right? And that was the theory. And, little by little, they made some inroads, but that wasn't really happening that fast because the early majority wasn't buying. How is this going to solve all my problems? How is this going to do payroll for me? Payroll's a lot bigger deal than most people think, unless they're the ones on the other side of the check, right? But so you had the entrenched average software developer during those days, the early majority through the laggards, right? They were blown away by this stuff. They looked at it and they were just totally intimidated, didn't know what to do with it. I mean, they would usually, sometimes the laggards would look at a Macintosh and say, toy. But some people would look at this stuff and say, this is amazing. I have no idea how to even begin programming something like that. They're still doing their flowcharts and taking their cards down, or using a terminal or whatever. But the early adopters, the innovators, were looking at things like Smalltalk, Lisp, Eiffel, and Objective-C were being used by the innovators, and some early adopters. Some people were saying, I could really take a strategic advantage here. C and C++ were making big inroads. C in the engineering community, as Bruce talked about, systems engineering, we used to do everything in assembler, C is better. Right? They could see that, so they did. And then they started using C++, unfortunately. And but they were making a lot of inroads at that point in time. Again, this is the late 80s. The early adopters and the early majority were starting to use PCs. They were starting to realize, what? If I use PCs instead of terminals, I can start doing things like word processing at my desk, in addition to all the other stuff. And pretty much most of the people in mainstream businesses that were using PCs at the time, most of what they used was a terminal emulator, right? And a few other programs, word processing, spreadsheets maybe, games when the boss wasn't looking. And most of them came with what installed on it as a programming language? BASIC. No one would ever use that for real work, right? So, meantime, BASIC is making an inroads into business, believe it or not. Anybody who knows anything about software and software theory and stuff would never use BASIC, right? But if it's the only thing installed on your PC, that's what you start using. So anyway, so that's what they're doing. And every once in a while, somebody come up with this multi-Windows platforms for PCs. I guess they saw Macintosh and thought, maybe we should do something like that. And there was a bunch of different things out there, including Windows 1 and Windows 2, which not a whole lot of people cared about, but they would start to make some inroads. But all of a sudden, early 1990s, the GUIs crossed the chasm. There was just enough. And why did they cross the chasm? Windows 3.0 came out. What was the big deal about Windows 3.0? Windows 3.0 was the first real Windows that you could get your word processing in one window, your spreadsheet in another window, your terminal emulator in another window, and sometimes they could even talk to each other. And it just happened. The pent-up demand, all of a sudden, Microsoft had the in. They already had the PCs installed. It wasn't that big a deal. They made it attraction enough. You install Windows, and all of a sudden, GUIs crossed the chasm. Apple didn't do it, for the majority of mainstream business. And then this Microsoft came up with this thing called Visual Basic. What a joke, right? If you're doing Smalltalk, what a joke. You're using BASIC? There's Smalltalk out there. Well, Visual Basic. I'm a BASIC programmer. I got to do Windows now. Visual Basic. This works, right? You sometimes read the press release about Visual Basic. It's pretty amazing. And actually, quite honestly, Visual Basic had things that none of the Smalltalks had in it at the time. Although Smalltalks people were playing around, the innovators had been playing around with window builders already. And anyway, so shortly after that, Digitalk came out with Smalltalk V for Windows. All of a sudden, the price got jacked up a bit. And then a little while after that, Visual C++ came out. Again, a really bad idea. Systems engineering language to build Windows applications. But all of a sudden, this whole idea of visual programming was the killer app builder, right? Visual programming was the way to do all this stuff. Nobody wanted to code up all these windows by hand. Well, some people did, but, nobody wanted. So visually building these user interfaces, people are still trying to figure out how to get past the stuff they learned before, programming these structured sequential code. And how do I do this in a window? Well, if I build all this stuff, then all I got to do is hook into a few places and hopefully it'll work. And the shopping cart demo of how I built a little shopping cart always seemed intriguing, so I buy a Visual Basic or Visual whatever. And if I realize Visual Basic probably wasn't the answer, all of a sudden I might say, hey, there's something better than Visual Basic? Yeah, Park Place comes out with VisualWorks, Smalltalk for Windows in 1992. Window Builder Pro for Smalltalk V comes out. There was earlier versions of that for earlier versions of Smalltalk. And DataTalk comes out with their own version of Park's Workbench, which is kind of similar to that. And then eventually IBM gets into the game, does Visual Age for Smalltalk. Was that 96 or 95?
Actually, Visual Age Smalltalk came out after Visual Age, but Visual Age
But who
was
cared?
Smalltalk.
Yeah.
And it was actually, I think, a little bit before Parks.
Okay.
And Parks actually came from, they saw what we were doing and did something similar.
Yeah, there's different versions of that story. But anyway, Rick's is probably more accurate. Rick's is probably more accurate in that case. But anyway, so the glory days of Smalltalk, 92 to 96. All right. What happened during those days? Now, some people who were programming in C and C++, they were so busy trying to figure out how to get things to work, they didn't look up and see that Smalltalk was happening, right? So there's a lot of people who just didn't even realize what was going on in the Smalltalk industry. But it was pretty hot. The glory. If you were a Smalltalk programmer in 1992 to 96, you got paid pretty well. You had a lot of fun most of the time. It was great. Smalltalk was discovered by Wall Street. Anybody hear of anybody using Ruby up in Wall Street these days? It happens. Yeah. Wall Street's pretty innovative. Because Wall Street can very quickly say, let's see, if I save this much time doing this and I make so much per transaction, they're driven by money. They're not driven by politics. Because everybody up there is incented to make money. So they're usually pretty quick. So they were one of the first people in there. Texas Instruments started doing some pretty radical things in the silicon industry. They actually used They were first people to take a real serious crack at Gemstone's active object-oriented database, which is a pretty fascinating product, unfortunately no longer around. IBM got into it. They started figuring out that maybe we should get on the bandwagon. The big and medium consulting firms were getting into this. Telecom industry, insurance industry, all these folks, they were spending a lot of money in this area. It was hard to keep up with them. So if you had Smalltalk on your resume and you had done anything real with it, write your ticket. At that time, there was what I would call the big three Smalltalk specialty shops. One was Knowledge Systems Corporation, which I happened to work for. Another was the Object People, and the other was Object Technology International. Now, actually, all these three shops kind of grew up with Smalltalk. As Smalltalk was being used by real people, you'd find most of the serious projects, one of these three companies was involved in it, if not two or three of them, in some way. Basically, we were the guys. I want to say we out of the big three. We were the guys who were saying, okay, you want to use this for real? We were the guys helping those early adopters figure out how do we get this 80% to 100% working, and out there with the people trying to commercialize this stuff. And each of them we all overlapped a little bit, but you could basically identify that Object Technology International, they were really into making the technology, the low-end stuff work, the platform upon which you're building. Knowledge Systems was really into let's get this application working, and the Object People were basically training people what the Smalltalk stuff was. And said we each had some of our own training and everything else, but that was really really kind of covered the gamut of all the services you'd want that the vendors had left off. And each of them grew to between 50 and 200 people during that time. A lot of folks, when you're talking about it. How many 50 to 200 person Ruby companies are out there right now? ThoughtWorks, if you want to call them there's not a whole lot. A lot of them are like, people around here, 2, 3, 5, 10 people, which is how these big three started out in the late 80s and early 90s. Okay? The vendors grew during this time. In fact, not only did the Park Place and Digitalk grow to 100 to 200 people each, but new people started getting into the game. Enfin, Dolphin, I think there were probably some others. IBM acquires Object Technology International at the time, which were really, Object Technology kind of quietly became another Smalltalk vendor, and before anybody noticed, they got bought by IBM. All this happened during that time frame. So, Smalltalk in the mid-90s was pretty much right there. We're threatening to really cross the chasm, right? I mean, we definitely had a bunch of early adopters with a bunch of visionaries using this stuff. And, people with real money, the guys over here, the early part of the early majority were doing stuff. We had those toeholds right there. Anderson Consulting, said IBM, people up on Wall Street. We had toeholds in all these places. Swiss banks. So we have several toeholds over the chasm. So what do you do when you have several toeholds over the chasm? You should fly, right, and do all the right things. So of course, what happens is Park Place Systems, who are the purists, and that's the culture. And when I say this, by the way, I'm not trying to put any of these folks down. I mean, they had their perspective. They were doing the best they could. They didn't even know what the chasm looked like. I mean, these guys were out at Palo Alto where people poured money into them to do cool technology, and they had this great vision, paperless office, which worked in their world. And they were just, trying to take what they learned and bring it to the rest of the people. But, basically their idea was children should be able to use this Dynabook to express their creativity. We own the vision. We have to keep this thing pure, and in the midst of that, sometimes people were paying them lots of money and weren't getting service because they were asking to do things that weren't pure. And the investors who invested in Park Place were kind of like, yeah, pure stuff. Cross the chasm, will you? We invested a lot of money in here. We want to see you guys make it big. So you had this major conflict happening at this company. You had the people who founded the company, and you had the people who were investing in the company. And then the result of this is these guys just ate their young. I mean, anybody who tried to come alongside Park Place, people providing the services, say, hey, we want to work with you guys, want to see Smalltalk succeed. Oh, yes, sure, we want to work with you. And you release a product, and then 6 months later, Park Place would announce, we have a product just like theirs, and you're dead, right? And they would do this time and time again. Anybody, it's just amazing. They didn't mean to be mean. I mean, they were just doing it because they were trying to grow their company, right? So, they kind of ticked off the people that were trying to help bring it there, and they weren't real popular with their customers either. Digitalk, they're kind of more like the hobbyists. These are the guys who, they got happy about getting on the PC and being there first and having all this incredible success. We've sold more copies of Smalltalk than Park Place ever dreamed of selling, and they were partially right. But, people they were selling to early on were the guys who read the Byte magazines, right, and would pay $69. And now all of a sudden they're getting the early majority trying to say, we want this stuff to work. And, in fact, IBM paid them a bunch of money to do a bunch of things, and instead of taking that money and making their stuff more reliable, they said, let's build a whole bunch of new products. We're going to be the next Microsoft. We're going to own software developing on the PC. So that didn't work out real well. And then IBM, who were, they would be the big business. Yeah. Right. So anyway, so IBM, the big business pragmatists, right? Their ideal was, look, we own big business, and we're tired of these chumps. Digitalk, Park Place. These guys don't get it. We need to make this real. OTI is there saying, yeah, we do understand the need for reliable systems, and we've been building them. And IBM's like, great, you understand reliable systems. You understand what business people really need. These guys don't. We're going to buy you, and we're going to do this, right? So they do it. It results in the Visual Age family of products. And by the way, they were really tired and ticked of Microsoft taking away all their business in the business world. So they didn't really like the idea that Microsoft kind of owned that market for programmers these days. So they built the Visual Age family of products, all built on Smalltalk, was already alluded to. So all this is happening, and so we're right there, right at the peak, right? 1986, we got our toeholds over the chasm. So what happens? So while the press in the world's all over the internet, Park Place and Digitalk see IBM as their biggest competition. So these two incompatible cultures decide to merge. right? That's a pretty picture. They buy the 2 remaining Smalltalk product companies that they hadn't eaten yet, and they rename themselves Object Share. And during this time, there's so much chaos, they do not put out a new release of a product for 2 years. Is that really good for helping get over the chasm? Not. But that's okay, because IBM's there. Unfortunately, all of a sudden the hype comes out about Java. This is seen as the Microsoft killer. Somebody had to do it, right? Even though Microsoft's still out there, so I guess it didn't work. But Microsoft dominates and owns the desktop, and not the internet. And of course, the press is all over this. It's something to write about, right? So the press is all over this. IBM wants a piece of that action, and they say, yeah, we're going to join in with Sun because they're not Microsoft either, right? And so they join in, and all of a sudden, Visual Age for Java becomes the #1 priority, both in what they're funding. Java development is happening all over the world. I can tell you a long story where I'll make real short. I brought in these guys to help me sell Smalltalk at a company, and a salesman came in there and said, "Oh, you want to use Smalltalk? Everybody else is using Java. Why would you do that?" Didn't really help the sale. But this is what's happening. Basically, the vendors abandon themselves and abandon the product, right? And anyway, and at the same time, Park Place Digitalk is getting scared. They haven't released anything for 2 years, and then they finally make an announcement saying, "Oh, well, we're moving towards Java," known as a suicide letter in the Smalltalk community. So anyway, that's what happened. Not a good thing. There's still, if you want to find the brave orphan community of Smalltalk programmers, you can go to smalltalk.org and get pointers to them. There's still a lot of guys who haven't abandoned Smalltalk. And they're doing some really cool things. Not many people are noticing, but they're still out there. Okay, so a brief moment of silence. Okay. So, now we go on to the history of Ruby. What a nice guy. Have you never met Mats? He's a great guy. So, this guy Mats comes up, and in many ways, a little bit like Alan Kay, you read about what Mats says. Mats says, we are the masters, they are the slaves. Right? Alan Kay is like, hey man, we need to take this technology to put it in the hands of people, not have the technology be, us beckoning it, oh, can I please have 5 minutes on your mainframe, sir? Right? And kind of a visionary. Yeah, we're the masters, they're the slaves. Let's have an application-oriented programming language to build applications in. Right? Gets released in 1995. Before we go on to what happened next, brief interlude. Smalltalk Objective-C is dead. Right? 97 through the next few years. Some people realize it quicker than others, but basically that's happened. Smalltalk died. Objective-C had probably been dead long ago, other than Steve Jobs kept it alive for a while in some form. And C++ should have been killed long ago for anything related to applications, at least. But now we have Java and C#. Now, though these are both a vast improvement over C++, let me see. How can I describe this? Well, I can't really come up with any good words, so let's just move on. So anyway, during this time, this 2001, this book called The Programming Ruby, The Pragmatic Programmer's Guide comes out. Now, how many people have you ever heard of this book? Right? Nobody ever heard of Ruby. I mean, when I say nobody, there was a couple people who ever heard of Ruby. But these guys who wrote the Pragmatic Programmer book, which sold a decent amount of copies, wrote a very good book, decided, what do we do for our next book? And, one of the things they put in a Pragmatic Programming Guide is you should learn a new language every year. So they figured they better do that. And they checked out Ruby and they said, this is pretty cool. Let's write a book about it. Right? Well, I don't think they had a clue what was going to happen when they wrote that book. But you got all these people who are like hating life because they're programming in C# and stuff, which, they liked it back in 97 when they first started learning Java, and it was this greenfield thing, and it felt a whole lot better than C++ did. But after a few years in it, it's getting harder and harder, and they're charging through it, and it's starting to feel painful, and there's just got to be something else I can use, right? And it doesn't take that long to read a book, so let's read a book on Ruby, and it's open source, maybe I can play around with that. Well, enough people read that book, I guess, and started playing around with it. And one of the guys who played around with it, a few of the guys who played around with it, ended up putting together the system that would do internet stuff better than other stuff would. And they released Rails, and they put out a video. How many people have seen a video about Rails? Right? You and a whole bunch of other people that aren't in this room. And it was this opportunity for a new language to emerge, which was just kind of, when Java came out, there was all this talk about, there were people saying, I can't believe a new language emerged. We have all these other languages, a new language hasn't really emerged for a long time, and all of a sudden Java emerged, and we couldn't believe it. Why? Opportunity, right? And because Java just wasn't so much fun, and either as C# or anything else that has been out there and popular, there was this vacuum, and Ruby kind of filled it up, or at least starting to. So let's look at this, the similarities here. Right, object-oriented, dynamically typed language, which is awesome, right? And as Bruce said, beauty doesn't win. And I don't program in Smalltalk anymore, but I think it's more beautiful than Ruby. Doesn't really matter because C++ and his other guys are so ugly that we're arguing over first and second place in a beauty contest, right? And you can think Ruby's prettier, and you can be wrong. That's fine. But it was an object-oriented, dynamically typed language, which is very different than just about everything else we have out there, right? PHP. I know there's object-oriented PHP and object-oriented Perl out there. Yeah, there's Objective-C too, and still not purely object-oriented, dynamically typed language. Anyway, both of these things were developed and refined over a few years. Many years before it actually hit the press. That's actually a big advantage. Is like, you don't want, okay, here's a version 0.1 of the language. Let's have this big press splash, right? In both cases, a lot of good stuff happened to it. A lot of the kinks got worked out before anybody even noticed it was there, which is really good. So by the time the innovators were even getting a hold of it, it was pretty good. And generally in both cases, there was pretty much, real innovators and kind of hobbyists until not the killer app, but the killer app builder, right? Just like when Smalltalk started having all these visual stuff, Rails comes out, right? All of a sudden, I don't have to learn all of that stuff from Ruby. I can just do something, take a demo, watch the video, and build a Rails app. Wow. I thought it was going to be a lot harder to learn a new language, right? So anyway, and both of us have this arrogant, zealous technical community, right? we're zealous here. In this group, we're zealous. To everybody outside this room, we're arrogant, right? And we ran into this. Smalltalk. We go to object-oriented OOPSLA conferences, and there were it would almost get the fisticuffs sometimes with Smalltalk versus C++ wars. Just because the Smalltalk guys just couldn't understand why anybody would be programming an application in C++, and they were just trying to explain with zeal why it's such a stupid thing, right? And the C++ guys didn't like being called stupid. And because actually they were smarter than the Smalltalk guys, because the Smalltalk guys, it was just way too complicated to program in C++ to build an app. So, we were not quite the same IQ as those guys. They were brilliant. If you can build a really good app in C++, you've got to be brilliant, right? You do. And they were, right? And there would be these wars, and they would just say, you arrogant Smalltalk guys, you just don't get it, right? And, any Ruby people been called arrogant? Yeah? Now, if you haven't talked to enough people yet. Or you haven't been paying attention, you're too busy having fun with Ruby. So we have the, Ruby versus Java wars, right? Some of the things I said here I could get shot for some places. But anyway. Also, what's also very interesting is very few people in academia know or care about either one of these languages. Even though they're, they should be a great thing to study. And you might, in some courses, they might be mentioned in some, what do they call the courses when you get an overview of 4 or 5 languages? A survey course. In survey course, you might get this. That's about it in academia, right? Nobody has a clue. In fact, unfortunately, in academia, most people don't know how to write real programs anyway. They're too busy teaching other people, right? So they haven't written a real application anyway, so they wouldn't know how painful it is to do it in C++ and how much better Smalltalk would be or Ruby. So very few people in academia even know about this stuff. And if they know about it, all they do is, oh yeah, I heard of that one. It's on my survey course. In fact, I teach it. They don't know or care about it. And in both cases, big business, they're afraid of the unknown. This stuff is just way too weird. It's not like the stuff that all the guys who have working for me, who understand way more about computers than I do, know. And those guys don't know anything about it. You're telling me I should change my whole company and have these guys who I'm paying lots of money just like learn this new language and everything's going to be simple, then I can fire half of them anyway? It just doesn't quite make sense, right? They also want security and knowing who's backing it, right? I mean, you never get fired for going with IBM 15, 20 years ago, right? You're not going to get fired for going with Microsoft now, right? We know who's backing this. We know the rest of the world is safe, right? Ruby's not safe. And the other similar is the community just doesn't get big business needs. They're not quite there. When I say that as a whole. Okay, the differences between Ruby and Smalltalk, there are some. I think one of the things is the big three are missing to bridge the chasm. I really think that those big three companies actually helped get those toeholds across the chasm. ThoughtWorks might be one. I put a question mark there. ThoughtWorks seems to be doing a lot of work with Ruby these days, and I think they're helping get those toeholds across. I'm not sure who else is. Maybe there's some others. I'm not on top of it. Some people didn't know who those big three were when they were first getting started, but they could be out there. But right now, it's not clear that there's a whole lot of people helping bridge that chasm into the big businesses. There's a low barrier to entry for Ruby compared to Smalltalk. At least in theory, it's lighter weight in that it's more familiar. Right? I mean, it used to freak me out when people said how hard it was to learn Smalltalk. Like, man, I can describe the entire language on one page, and you install an image and you start doing it. How hard is that? Right? It's a lot simpler than having to download a whole bunch of stuff, installing gems, all this kind of stuff. Right? But it's a lot more familiar to people who are used to dealing with file-based stuff. Right? And having code spread across a bunch of files, and you just download it, and it's easy to access. It's free, So anyway, so there's a lower barrier to entry. You don't have to pay $69 even to get started, right? Anyway, and then, but unfortunately, it's not clear where to start to the masses. People in this room, you've probably figured out where to get started on stuff. The average person is not clear where to get started on it. Open source, decentralized government versus tyranny, that's always a very good idea. One of the things we ran into, you were stuck with the vendors, right? And I mean, it was amazing. I'm a Smalltalk guru back then. I mean, I would speak at all the conferences, and I knew all the people. I knew all the founders of Park Place and stuff. And I had this list every release, of bugs in Smalltalk 80, and I'd offer them to them. I sent them several emails. And a new release would come out like, hey man, the bugs still aren't fixed. And I don't know how that happened. Just send it to me directly in email. I sent it to them directly in email. Guess what? Next release come out. It's not fixed. Right? And it was bad. Right? And I just kept that file with me every time a new release came. Okay, let me just go through the list of things, see if they fix those. Nope. They fixed 2, they fixed 3, whatever. It's just not a good idea. And even if they're the best vendors, and again, I'm trying to knock those guys. I mean, if you're one vendor trying to do this, it's hard if you don't have some kind of open source, some way that community can be included in that. The internet changes everything, at least a lot. Some people think the internet is like, since the internet, no reason to ever have a desktop app or something. You haven't done any video editing yet. There's a lot of reasons you still want to have desktop apps, right? The internet doesn't change everything, but it does change a lot. It definitely changes a lot, and that's something that Smalltalk really didn't have in its heyday. It tried to get onto the bandwagon at the end there, but you're gasping for air. Nobody notices. And then Smalltalk community in general missed the whole internet revolution. They were trying to. The little bit of activity it was doing, it was forward thinking was happening, but there wasn't a whole lot of forward thinking activity. They were just arguing over who's going to own who and silly stuff like that. And do we actually have anybody who's not going to be doing Java next year anyway? Whereas the Ruby Rails community is all over Web 2.0. All right, so there's some major differences here, which most of those differences I think are good. So that all said, does Ruby have a chasm to cross? What might that chasm be, and should I care? Is the theory even applicable? I think there's some differences between the 1957 cattle farmers and where we're at, but Ruby's open source, free language. Rails is free, an open source platform. Nobody's really buying either of these things. Do we care about this chasm thing? Because that's all about marketing to get people to buy. Well, from a language perspective, it doesn't seem like it makes sense, but the reality is, if you want to get paid, you have to pay attention to this. All right? Because, they may not be buying the language, but they're buying you. And you cost a lot more money than the language. And a lot of people don't understand that. It's maybe people will build their own servers, don't realize that, look, I don't cost anything when I play around with this thing for 3 days or 5 days, and I get it $20 cheaper than if I bought it from Dell. Right? I mean, no, you cost money. Right? Is there too much talk about the chasm? Is that even relevant? I'll tell you where the chasm isn't relevant. I deal with a lot of entrepreneurs. They come into my office. They have this idea. They start out with this idea and nothing else, and they got this idea, and for somehow they expect me for somewhere between $5,000 and $50,000 to get them over the chasm. And when I tell them, look, you can't get over the chasm for $5,000 to $50,000, they're like, well, then I got to. Somehow I got to. I only have $3,000. And I got to get there, and they're worried about this chasm. It's like, what you need to worry about is getting something you've got from a concept to something in the hand of an innovator. So don't worry about the chasm. But anyway, so where's Ruby? Here we are. I would say the innovators 95 to 2003 and still going. I'd say the up to 2003 was only innovators. And now the early adopters started kicking in around 2003 or so, and still going. Early majority. I don't know. Do we even have any toeholds yet over the chasm? Yeah, I think there are a couple. I don't think there's anywhere near as much as Smalltalk had. I think we're probably, I think the glory years of Smalltalk was 92 to 96. We're about 92, maybe 91.5 or something, right, with where we are in many ways. But because the internet changes everything, I don't think it's necessarily hard to leap either. Who cares about the early majority, you'd say? I don't want to work with those big companies anyway. I don't, personally. This is being recorded. Can you zap that? The innovators, the early adopters, they're a lot more fun to work with. These guys, they're bigger risk takers. In general, there's less riding on it, right? And there's just less stuff going on that you just don't want to deal with small companies. I work with a small company. Something's not going right, I go talk to the president about it. If I'm working for a big company, I can't even sometimes I can't even find who my manager is. But in the whole internet, now they have the internet, you get the long tail theory. I don't know who's heard of the long tail thing, right? You can make decent amount of money not being the leader, and that's okay, because we have distribution mechanisms that we didn't have way back when. I think that's definitely key. I don't think it's going to replace big business this year, next year, 5 years from now. If we just say, well, let's ignore the chasm, we still might be able to do this stuff for a few years, maybe 4 or 5 years. But somewhere along the line, we gotta deal with that. You also got to realize that the internet also means more competition for the early adopters. Attention. And by the way, early adopters are not stagnant people. It's like, walk around, I'm an early adopter. I will be the rest of my life. No. In fact, none of us are actually anywhere. There's so many different ways to look at markets. I can look at this thing. I'm an innovator. Education, apprenticeship, I've yet to meet anybody who's done as many crazy things in that area as I have. I've invested a lot of time and money of my life in that, and I still will. Right? When it comes to technology, especially software, I'm an early adopter. I want to find the innovators, the crazy 20-year-olds who don't have anything else to do with their life besides read about Ruby and stuff, right? And when I hear them start to get excited about something, then I start listening. Okay, can I take that and and do something with it. So I'm an early adopter when it comes down to that kind of stuff. Of course, early majority, I'm kind of like that. I got an iPod 2 or 3 years ago. There was no risk because it came with a printer that I bought. And of course, if you're an early majority, the first thing you ever do if you're looking at new technology is you find a low-risk project, that if it doesn't work, it's okay. So I gave mine to my son and helped him install his music because he didn't have much. And he was 8 at the time, right? So I helped him, and I'm convinced the stuff works. And I'm going to move all my music over to iPods sometime. And I know I'm going to do it before my mom gets her iPod. Right? So I'm the early majority. And then late majority, I've got 3 cars that are all paid for, and I'm keeping them until they turn to dust. And then I'm going to buy something. It's a slight upgrade. It'll be a used car, 3 or 4 years old probably. Okay? And I'll get it cheaper than you guys who buy new cars. That's what the late majority does. We get stuff cheaper. Right? And then the late market laggard, yeah, that's me. If you're not playing baseball in the day on grass and only take me out to the ball game, preferably on an organ that is slightly out of tune, it's not real baseball. All right? And all you guys are like this. You've got a little bit of laggard in you, and you've got a little bit of innovator in you, and you really got to pay attention to it at the point, that if you don't get over the chasm, eventually you're not going to get paid to do Rails or Ruby or anything. Right? Or not much, at least. Right? I mean, innovators don't have much money in the first place, and they're going to innovate with something else next year. Right? And all you're going to have is this T-shirt. Yeah, tried Ruby, tried Rails. What's next? Early adopters are going to be the same way. They just get the T-shirt later. Right? They say, yeah, I tried to use Ruby to help me get over the chasm, and it didn't work, so I'm going to try something else next. And if Ruby's not accepted by the early majority, all of a sudden, demand drops below supply. When demand drops below supply, that $250 an hour the best small talk programmers were getting in glory years, they can't find a job. And if they do find a job, it's like maintaining some old legacy code for $35 an hour or something. Right? They might get better than that. I mean, hopefully better, but the point is you take a pay cut if you can even find one of those jobs. So, it really matters. And even if you can, you're going to be maintaining a legacy app. How much fun is that compared to doing writing a new framework for Asterisk or something? So main point, if a long tail doesn't trump chasm theory, which I think it doesn't, although I think the long tail also shouldn't be ignored, and we really need to understand the early majority's needs. We're not going to get paid very much for very long. You can have a good run at it, guys. We had a great run at it for a few years. But, we don't get paid because we're smart. We don't get paid because we are able to learn. We don't get paid because we work out of our homes and that doesn't have to provide us office space. We get paid because somebody wants us to produce something of real value to them. Right? Dave Thomas, who probably made more money on small talk than anybody else I know when he sold OTI, Dave Thomas had this saying, he says, "He who ships wins." And he was right. He shipped. He won. Right? And not just him, but, the bottom line is, Eclipse.org, most of those guys, Rick, right? How many of those guys were OTI guys? Right? The guys who ship are still doing really cool stuff. Right? They may not be doing as cool a language, but they're still doing really cool stuff.
Or at least they're living on a Caribbean island.
Or they're living on a Caribbean island or something, right? You got to ship, and you got to have a record of shipping. And when I say ship, I'm not saying ship 0.2, right? Ship something that works that people are going to be using and rely on, etc. And you also just got to have the attitude of, it's better to give than to receive. If I'm not giving more value than I'm getting in whatever people are paying me, I got the wrong attitude. And I'm not going to be able to get paid along with that wrong attitude. Unless you got to run around the country and just, let people, nobody who knows you is still tracking you. The chasm's really, I think the leap over the chasm is a leap over the idea of self-focus to customer focus. Right? All the stuff, MERB is awesome, man. Get it to 1.0. Right? All the stuff is great, but you really got to get it, all these open source things. if they don't get to the point where these are reliable and people can use them, I'm just focusing on my pet project. My pet project is my pet project. It's not going to get me over the chasm. It's not going to be that much fun a few years from now. I mean, how many of them are abandoned already, right? Because they got other things to do. So danger. Here's a warning to you Rails folks. I've heard people say this. Ruby and Rails. Well, Rails is for people who know what they're doing. You just insulted everybody else who might be your customer, right? Or I want to work with smart people. Oh, no, I want to work with dumb people. Of course you want to work with smart people, but people are smart. Just because they don't know everything you know about Ruby or Rails doesn't mean they're not smart. A case study, I've had an entrepreneur come in who's a millionaire. I don't know how much money the guy's got, but you just tell by a few things he said he had more money than he needed. And in fact, I was trying to talk to him about the business case for the project he wants. He said, I really don't care if it makes money. I want it. Gives you an indication of how much money the guy has, right? But we mentioned to him that we thought the best technology used for what he wanted was Rails. And this is the kind of guy who, he's kind of like you guys. He stays up all night and reads stuff on the internet or whatever. He starts reading up on Rails and he went crazy. And he said, I can't believe that you think this is such great technology. I spent 60 hours reading this stuff, and there's not a single person on here who can write worth a darn. Now, I think he was a little bit frustrated and he missed some good things. And we try to point him some better things to read. But, realize the face of the Rails community isn't what the early majority wants to read. Right? And somehow we've got to figure out how to get past that when we're talking to the early majority. Second danger, Rails makes web applications easy. Right? Back in the early 90s, when I interviewed somebody who had 2 years of Smalltalk experience, they did some incredible stuff. They were all brilliant. Well, most of them. Right? They did some really neat stuff. After Visual whatever came out, I interviewed guys who have been doing Smalltalk for 2+ years who didn't understand anything about objects. They built GUIs for 2.5 years. They scripted some things together. Right? And you see the same things in the Rails community happening now. There's all kinds of people using Rails who don't know it, who aren't really good at building good applications. How's that? That politically correct enough? Right? And it's okay if you know that. If you know what you can and can't do, it's fine. We all have to start there. When I was 20-some years old doing Smalltalk stuff, there was amazing things that I did that I look back at and say how stupid they were now. Right? But you got to be a little bit, you got to realize there's stuff to know. Just because you've been doing Rails for a year doesn't mean you're a world-class application builder and that you're ready for the early majority and dealing with some fairly hairy systems. So, when you need discernment, if you're hiring people, you need discernment in how you're going to hire them and how you're going to put that team together. Know who the guys are who are pretty junior and have stuff to learn and who the guys aren't. If you're joining a team, you need to have that same discernment, right? Because you end up getting stuck with a whole bunch of guys who are just like you. Eventually, if you communicate well enough, you'll learn some stuff together. But it's really good to get people from lots of perspectives. You need guys like Bruce and me who don't know how to program that well, but we know a few other things, right? Hopefully. So the real chasm is, long tail or not, I think functional teams serving the customer is what it's going to take to cross the chasm. It's not about you. It's not about how cool I can do, how many open source projects I've been, how many neat demos I can give, whatever. It's really about, if we're going to help this thing, if you want to be doing Ruby and cooler stuff than Ruby, because, some of the things that Bruce laid out is the journey, where are you going? It's going to be a great journey. Some of the things he's talking about, we did some incredible things in Smalltalk that most people don't know about just because it died. But there's some incredible stuff that the longer you plug at it, you're going to start leveraging what you're doing now and taking it further and further. But you can only do it if you're providing functional teams that are really serving the customer. Otherwise, it's not going to last that long. When Smalltalk was at the brink of the chasm, the big three and others, and I won't say it was just those three companies, they worked really hard together to serve the customers and get the toeholds in there. They use best practices and team tools. In fact, a whole lot of the best practices you read about today, came out of folks that did Smalltalk and did a bunch of stupid things in the 80s and figured out some of the stuff in the 90s. we put craftsmen with less experienced people, because let's face it, when you have supply that's behind demand, you got to work with some people who don't have as much experience with you than you do. Right? Or you might be the person who's, I'm trying to get on the supply side. Right? I'm trying to get to the point where I have something to offer. You got to do it, and you got to learn to do it. Don't say, hey, well, you're 2 years behind me. I really don't have anything to do with you. And Bruce talked about that a little bit. When we ran into people who didn't understand or ran into a roadblock, we said, okay, well, let's help you get over this roadblock. Yeah, the vendor has a bug in their thing. How do we get around that? I think MERB is a great example of that. Rails is too slow. Well, let's figure out ways to get around that, right? And work with the companies who are complaining that it's too slow to help them get past it. There's really nothing to stop Ruby from crossing the chasm as far as I'm concerned. Technically, there's no reason. There's things that have to be done technically to cross the chasm, but I don't think, you're built. I mean, the stuff that we did with Smalltalk to solve the problems back then, there's no reason you can't do them in Ruby. In fact, there's lots of reasons you can do stuff in Ruby that we didn't really succeed at in Smalltalk because of some other technology platform things. So there's really nothing to stop you guys from crossing the chasm other than yourselves, ourselves. I think I'm part of the community, I guess. Just haven't been as part of long because I'm an early adapter rather than innovator. Work with others without compromising. Make deprecated, right? Don't give up on what makes Ruby great, but realize, you got to work with people who have real problems. All customers deserve respect and good service, even if they don't get it. And some of their reactions, they might call you stupid at times because you don't understand something. You probably don't understand it, and get past their calling you stupid and still work with them anyway. Include the big guys. These guys you may not want to work with. We need those toeholds. And I'm not saying everybody has to go work for a big company tomorrow. But when a big company approaches you and they don't know anything about what you're doing, work with them anyway. Somebody should. And somebody please help academia. I don't even know how to help them. I say that I'm not trying to knock them, but it's like they've been teaching a lot of the same stuff that I learned in my computer science courses 20 years ago. And it was not the right stuff then, and it just somehow anybody who really has a passion for going back to academia and helping them learn this stuff, great, go for it. I hope you succeed, but it really has it has a huge impact on why all the guys working for the big company don't understand Ruby, right? In fact, it also has a big impact why Ruby might make it where Smalltalk didn't, because they learned, and you did learn in academia things about Unix and files and stuff. Right? And it's not as big a leap, right? So, take advantage of that. Don't settle for mediocrity of service. Learn to know the difference between software craftsmanship and coding yourself into a corner. A lot of people don't even realize what they're doing. Take some time to learn. Read about best practices. Don't just read what other Ruby guys are doing. A lot of the things that are being used in the Java community, there's actually some smart stuff there. They're dealing with problems that make it, the problems are harder because you're using Java, but they're dealing with real problems. There's best practices that you really need to learn from, and understand the needs of the customers, understand why they're real problems, they're real concerned about them. Don't overpromise and underdeliver. Every time I hear, Rails is 10 times faster than everything, oh, come on. Maybe for programming that line of code it is, but that's not what a software project's about, right? You got to interact with the customers. You got to figure out what the requirements really are. Now once you understand the requirements, you might be able to implement it faster. The project might be 2 to 3 times faster and half the price or less. Promise them that. Don't promise them 10 times. You're setting yourself up for failure, and then you're going to call them the jerks because they didn't have the requirements together. Nobody ever has their requirements together. I've been doing this for 20-some years. Nobody has their requirements together. No matter how big their document is or how much they say they understand it, they're not together. And that's something you got to deal with in a software project. And it's not going to be 10 times faster to communicate just because you're using Rails. Especially when you're an innovator who hasn't worked with these guys yet. You got to learn how to talk to people.
So don't do that. Don't exploit the going market rate just because of somebody might offer you a ridiculous amount of money to do some Rails programming. If you really don't know what you're doing and you know you can't deliver, if you're not positive you can deliver it, don't just take the money and say, oh, I earned that money and oh well, they blew it. Be realistic about what you're worth and if you can provide value. When Jay goes into a place and does some incredible stuff with voice over IP, he's worth a ton of money for those 2 hours, right? But if you're hiring Jay to do something he's never seen before, he's not worth that same kind of money. If somebody hires you to do something, make sure that you're qualified to get what they're paying you. If you really don't believe you can provide more value than they're paying you, don't do it. You're going to be sorry later. They're going to be sorry later. Just hold on for that next job, right? Be careful of that, and don't make yourself hard to work with. There's going to be compromises when you're providing service to people. I want to work out of my house every day. I don't get to do it because I decided I'm going to serve the customer, and sometimes I just can't serve very well from my house. All right? There's a lot of different things there. We can talk about that, but I'm over time anyway. So best practices and real value. Yeah, I would say make everyone read this book, even though books are outdated, right? There's a whole lot of people doing Rails that don't understand Agile web development. The reason OTI shipped is some of the practices that they used that were very unorthodox at the time. But they did crazy things like write tests first. And somehow their stuff was more reliable than some of the other guys. It wasn't because they just had this weird quirk. They wanted to write tests first. They learned that it works better that way. They did a lot of things. Not necessarily all the Agile practices I would recommend, but most of those Agile practices came from the guys who, when they were 20, they were doing the same stuff you guys were doing. Some of you young guys. I keep saying you guys because there's some older folks in here. Sorry. I'm talking to the Ruby's Conf guys. There were 12. But they were doing a lot of the stuff you were doing with Smalltalk. Right? And they learned some of those things don't work very well in the long run. So a lot of those best practices and the whole idea of Agile web development. Agile web development doesn't just mean I don't write documentation. Right? It doesn't. In fact, you got to write necessary documentation. You don't have to write unnecessary documentation. So get it. That's one book to read. It's very obvious because it has Rails in it. Learn the whys of extreme programming. You may not adopt all the practices of extreme programming, but learn the whys. If you read the books about it, especially this really good one over here, you can get it on Amazon used, and I won't even get a royalty. But the whole idea, learn why people got excited about extreme programming and the things that they're doing there. And pair programming, which may sound really weird because I'm a geek, I don't like people. I don't want to pair with somebody all day long. You kidding me? That's why I got into computers, so I don't have to talk to people. Right? Learn the whys of this stuff. I would really say invest in learning these things. And just learn to program with others. And that doesn't mean over an IM connection, or whatever. I mean, just really sit down with people and learn right next to them. That's a great way to bring up the guys who are less experienced than you, and also learn from people who have different experiences than you. Spend time really with them one-on-one, working through stuff, and you can get really exhausted doing that, trying to communicate with people who aren't on the same wavelength. But it's really worth it. I think that's going to help Ruby cross the chasm. I'm done.